on Slack Technologies is Evelyn Baker, TD Ameritrade Network contributor. Welcome to the show, Evelyn. Good morning. Hope you had a great Labor Day weekend. You've obviously been taking a look at some stuff across Twitter and other research. What's sticking out on Slack?
Hey guys, yeah, so anticipation is definitely building for Slack Technologies to report earnings later today after the market closes, especially after we saw such a strong report out of Zoom video communications last week and its subsequent stock run up. But with that, I want to go ahead and introduce the first tweet that I found for you guys. And this one is responding to another Twitter user who asked if they believe the stock, or if they believe that Slack is going to report a good earnings report. And this Twitter user said 100% it's gonna be a good one. Slack Connect and adding more customers will increase the revenue. Amazon partnership, work from home, all signs point to bullish sentiment. I'm long work. So Slack is expected to add about 6,000 new paying customers for its current quarter, the one that it'll be reporting on this afternoon. And that compares to the 12,000 new paying customers it added over its last quarter. So that's definitely a decrease. However, with Slack and Amazon, their partnership that was announced back in June, and Slack being a popular work from home name, like this tweet says, all of those do seem to be bullish signs that people are talking about on Twitter, which I was looking at earlier today. But however, Slack as a work from home name, it has underperformed some of those other companies in the space. The company Slack is only up about 20% year over year, and that compares to Zoom Video, which has seen an immense run up, and even Microsoft. And Microsoft has the Slack competitor Teams software as well. But I also have another tweet for you guys, and this one comes from a Twitter user named Howard Frazier. And this tweet says that the concept of organizational agility is real. If you removed work and Zoom from my day-to-day right now, it would be a problem. It would slow down our whole company. Slack and Zoom, both names have really become essential to companies using its product right now in this work from home environment. However, there is competition for Slack, including, like I mentioned earlier, Microsoft Teams, and even the gaming communication platform Discord that has been rolling out more business services. I've been seeing a lot of talk about Discord on social media as well. But Kevin, here I want to direct a question to you. Going into Slack's report later today, and with the company only being up 20% compared to its other peers in the work from home space, is there just too much competition, like Teams and Discord, for Slack to have much future potential?
Yeah, Evelyn, in a work from home world where we find ourselves right now, Slack should be doing better, right? Everyone thinks, my goodness, Slack should be flourishing in this environment. But you just said the operative word in this whole conversation, which is competition. Zoom has kind of taken over the discussion in terms of how popular it is. Microsoft has got Teams. Obviously, the deep pockets of Microsoft says they're here to stay. You've got Cisco WebEx, which is the old, crusty veteran in this conversation. So you're right. The problem with Slack may be competition and the fact that so many firms have found their niche, and Slack, though they have a niche, they just don't have the wow factor that the Zooms of the world have. They don't have the deep pockets and infrastructure that Microsoft Teams has. I think this is a company trying to find its identity and struggling. But I'm sure, that being said, it'll still be a good quarter for Slack.
Yeah, undoubtedly, Kevin. I mean, the numbers are still strong for this company. But to your point, I look at it as, what else do they have to offer? If you have a company like Cisco coming in, they can offer you the solutions to all of these problems. Microsoft can do the same, where, just that tweet that Evelyn had, you need Zoom and Slack. Okay, well, it's not a package deal then. It's two separate companies that you have to make two separate contracts with. It just makes things take a little bit longer. Likely it's going to be at a premium unless they want to erode their margin. So there's a lot of question marks still here, but it's been an interesting story, and it's been one that's been executed on pretty strongly despite the stock performance being a little bit underperforming some of the other names. But Evan, we got to run. Great stuff. As always, we'll see what happens when this company does report. To help us further this conversation and break down even more action, we got Andy Swan, the co-founder of LikeFolio.com, throwing his hat into the mix here as well. Andy, my biggest concern with this company, as I have with a lot of these companies that are single service, single product, is what else can you do for me once you saturate your growth?
Yeah, for sure. I think when we look at Slack, we like to actually, this is one of the rare occasions where we actually like to look at overall mentions rather than purchase intent mentions, because for Slack, they are on a usage-based billing model. And, how much people are actually using the product matters quite a bit to them. And so when we look at that, you can see big spike during the pandemic when that first came on. But then this quarter that they're about to report, we're seeing a nice 19% year over year increase. The quarter that we're about a month into, also a nice 20% increase in terms of pace. So I think in a vacuum, those are really good numbers. But when you zoom out and talk about what Evelyn and Kevin was going through, it makes a lot of sense to start thinking about, okay, well, what's the competition doing? Zoom absolutely blows these numbers away. Microsoft Teams, we believe, is blowing these numbers away. And so from a competitive standpoint, they're lagging from just internally, their own internal metrics as a single company in the marketplace, doing very well. The one thing I will say competitively that may be falling in Slack's favor is that the consumer happiness levels for this company are 76%. And they've actually gone up throughout the pandemic and the quarantine. That's not true of Microsoft Teams and Zoom. That tells me that users are sticking around and that they'll likely, advocate for Slack inside of their company walls, which I'm not sure is happening necessarily for Microsoft Teams and Zoom, where we start to see a little bit of people getting tired of those. So I think Slack has some great things going for it. I think they'll have good numbers. It'll get really tough when you start to compare them to Zoom and Teams, like Evelyn was saying. So I think that the data here supports the overall narrative of this segment, and that is great company. What else can they do? Because they've got some really, really big competitors that are growing faster and have deeper pockets, like Kevin said, right on the money.
Andy, here's my question. They made some headlines during a lot of this when their CEO came out and said, we're under attack. And, he said things like that, some kind of, in terms of a competitive environment, he kind of gave the hint that they were losing in some of these competitions. And so is he kind of hurting their own brand by saying, or is he showing us the fact that when it comes to this competition, they're not doing very well and they may have to still be a profitable and healthy company, but they're just going to have to take their place in third or fourth place in this room of, a couple absolute high flyers like Zoom that only has a couple things that Zoom can put out, but they are clearly, Zoom is becoming a verb for what we're doing here, kind of like Uber and some of these other names that have become that have become verbs. So do they have an identity crisis? Are they just not, willing to step up and fight this fight? That's what it appears to me on the surface.
Well, I think you make a good point. I wouldn't call it an identity crisis. I think they kind of are who they always have been, and that is a company that, caters to a little bit smaller businesses, that makes life a lot easier in a normal world, whether you're traveling or not. I think Zoom benefited tremendously from the fact that people could not meet in person. I think even Microsoft Teams, having those corporate relationships already in place, benefited tremendously because they could just turn on Teams and kind of move on, whereas Slack has to go through a pretty tough sales cycle with every one of these companies that they try to onboard. So I think that Slack is the same company it's been, and that's considered now a little bit of a bummer because you watch the Zooms of the world, you watch the Microsoft Teams, you watch the DocuSigns really accelerate what they were already able to do because of the pandemic, and it's just not there for Slack. There is some growth. It's nice, and they are a really well-liked company by their customers, but it gets tough when they start talking about the competitors because Slack just wasn't there. It wasn't as necessary, and it wasn't as easy to make that switch as Zoom and Teams were for others.
Andy, kind of final thoughts here. You alluded to something there that I think is very interesting. As a successful entrepreneur yourself, I feel like you probably have your finger on the pulse of the startup space. Is Slack more of a niche company than it's really kind of presented as? Is this a company that's target market is startup companies, smaller companies, and less so giant corporations that maybe have those pre-existing relationships with a Cisco or a Microsoft? And does that kind of, define everything that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's some truth to that. I think they're trying to redefine themselves, but that takes some time. And the other thing I'll say is, I think if it were up to the end user, in most cases, people prefer Slack over Microsoft Teams. That's very clear to us in our data. But it's not always up to the end user. When you're talking about companies of thousands of employees with an existing contract with Microsoft that they can just turn a switch and all of a sudden they have Teams, well, guess what? All of those end users are going to be using Teams, whether they'd like to be using Slack or not. Whereas a company like ours, small companies, even up to a few hundred employees, it is about what the employees want. And so I think that's the big difference. And I think Slack will continue to do very well in those situations, but is going to have a tough time going up market against really tough competition from Microsoft.
And last question here, what's the future look like for Slack then? Is the end goal Microsoft buying this company, or are they going to have to develop more products?
Well, it's one or the other. I think, I don't know that it's Microsoft. I think it's probably one or the other. They have to either develop more products and go horizontally a little and create a better ecosystem type of thing, full work from home suite, or they have to become part of a company that does that. Whether that's Cisco, that could be interesting. Some other computing names I think are out there. Microsoft seems to have made its bet on Teams, and we'll see how it goes. But I do think those are the kind of the two options as we head into 2021, 22 for this company. I think the company's probably pretty open about that. They seem to be a very honest company with their billing structure, the way that the executives communicate with investors. I love that. So I love listening to these calls. I suggest everybody do the same when they report.